If a surgeon cried every time he cut into a patient, the patient would bleed to death on the table. To save the life, the doctor must become steady, focused, detached. In that moment, he cannot afford to feel everything. He cannot hesitate because the procedure looks painful. He cannot stop because the sight of blood makes him uncomfortable. He must see the situation clearly, coldly, almost clinically. And strangely enough, life often works the same way. History is written by the men who had the surgical capacity to be heartless when the moment demanded it. They understood a dark, fundamental truth, that a cold heart is sometimes the only tool sharp enough to save a burning ship. The world teaches you something very different. It teaches you to be kind, to be compassionate, to always consider other people's feelings. From childhood, you are told that empathy is the highest virtue, that kindness should guide every decision, that caring deeply for others is what makes a person good. But while you were learning to be gentle, someone else was learning how to use that gentleness against you. They learned that guilt can influence your decisions. They learned that sympathy can weaken your boundaries. They learned that emotional pressure can push you into choices you would never make with a clear mind. And this is the uncomfortable truth most people avoid confronting. Some of the most powerful individuals in history were not known primarily for their kindness. They were known for something colder, the ability to detach from emotion when the situation demanded it. Napoleon had it. Machiavelli wrote about it. Steve Jobs practiced it. They understood something most people refuse to accept. Sometimes compassion clouds judgment, and sometimes the most rational decision looks heartless. Before we continue, I want to ask you something. Do you believe powerful leaders should be compassionate or ruthless when necessary? Write your answer in the comments. And if you enjoy psychological strategy and Stoic philosophy, subscribe and share this with someone who thinks too deeply about life. Because today, we are exploring a concept that many people misunderstand: the power of being heartless. Now, when most people hear the word heartless, they imagine cruelty. They imagine someone who lacks empathy, someone cold, someone indifferent to the suffering of others. But that is not what we are discussing here. Today, we are not teaching you how to be a villain. We are teaching you how to be effective. We are exploring the idea of strategic detachment, the ability to temporarily silence emotion so that clarity can take control, the ability to step outside emotional chaos and act with precision, almost like a machine. But that does not mean becoming emotionless. And it certainly does not mean becoming a psychopath. A psychopath lacks empathy because of a biological deficit. They are incapable of feeling what others feel. The man we are discussing today is something very different, the Stoic achiever. He has empathy, he has compassion, but he governs it. He does not allow emotion to override reason. He views his emotions as information, data, signals, but never as commands. In other words, he feels deeply, but he decides carefully. This distinction is extremely important because many of the problems people face in life are not caused by a lack of intelligence. They are caused by emotional interference. A leader knows the correct decision, but hesitates because he fears criticism. A manager knows an employee must be removed, but delays the decision because he feels guilty. A person stays in a toxic relationship because they pity the other person. A business owner refuses to enforce standards because they do not want to appear harsh. In each of these situations, emotion overrides clarity. And when emotion overrides clarity, consequences follow. This is why the Stoic philosopher Seneca once wrote something fascinating. Pity is the failing of a mind overexcited by the sight of suffering. The wise man doesn't pity, he helps. Think about that for a moment. If you see a man drowning and you pity him so deeply that you jump into the water without thinking, and both of you drown, you have accomplished nothing. The heartless man behaves differently. He remains on the dock. He observes the situation. He calculates the distance, and then he throws a rope. He does not become consumed by the drowning man's panic. He solves the problem. In other words, emotional detachment is not cruelty. It is strategic clarity. And this brings us to the first principle of strategic detachment. Rule 1. Stop trying to save everyone. One of the fastest ways to destroy your own life is trying to rescue people who refuse to rescue themselves. Many people grow up believing that compassion means always helping, always understanding, always giving one more chance. But reality teaches a harsher lesson. Not everyone who is struggling wants to be saved. Some people want comfort. Some want attention. Some want someone else to carry the consequences of their choices. And if you are always the one stepping in to fix their problems, you slowly become responsible for a life that is not yours. The Stoics understood something most people learn too late. You cannot control other people. You cannot force discipline into someone who loves chaos. You cannot build a future for someone who refuses to build it themselves. Yet many people continue trying. They lend money that will never return. They solve problems that will appear again next week. They sacrifice their peace trying to repair someone else's repeated mistakes. And the result is predictable. Resentment, exhaustion, emotional burnout. Because compassion without limits becomes self-destruction. The Stoic achiever does something that often looks heartless to the outside world. He stops rescuing people who refuse to change, not because he lacks empathy, but because he understands responsibility. Every adult is responsible for the direction of their own life. And the moment you start carrying someone else's responsibility, you begin abandoning your own. Sometimes the most intelligent decision is not intervention. It is distance. Distance from the chaos. Distance from the excuses. Distance from people who expect you to solve problems they refuse to confront. This is the first step in strategic detachment, recognizing that your time, your energy, and your focus are limited resources. And spending those resources trying to fix everyone around you is one of the fastest ways to lose control of your own life. Once you understand this, something important changes. You stop trying to save everyone. And that decision alone will make some people call you heartless. But in reality, it is simply the beginning of wisdom. And this leads to the next principle. Rule 2. Not every situation deserves your compassion. One of the most dangerous ideas society teaches is that compassion should always guide your decisions. But compassion without boundaries can destroy judgment. Imagine a leader who refuses to remove an incompetent employee because he feels bad for them. The result? The entire team suffers. Imagine a parent who refuses to discipline their child because they do not want to hurt their feelings. The result? The child grows without structure. Imagine a business owner who continues supporting a failing project because people have already invested years of work into it. The result? The entire company collapses. In each case, compassion interferes with reality. And sometimes, reality requires difficult decisions. History offers a striking example of this principle. In 1799, during the siege of Jaffa, Napoleon's army was struck by a devastating plague. Thousands of soldiers were sick. There was not enough medicine, there was not enough transport to move them, and an enemy army was rapidly approaching. If Napoleon stayed to care for the sick soldiers, the entire army would be trapped and destroyed. Napoleon made a decision that shocked many observers. The most terminally ill soldiers were reportedly given lethal doses of opium so they would not fall into enemy hands. Then Napoleon moved the rest of the army forward. To sentimental observers, this decision looked monstrous, but to a strategist, the situation was clear. The survival of 30,000 men depended on the willingness to make a brutal choice. Napoleon understood something most people struggle to accept. In the game of survival and leadership, sometimes the pawn must be sacrificed to save the king. Now, this principle may feel uncomfortable. It should, because it forces us to confront a difficult truth. Kindness is admirable. Compassion is valuable. But when compassion interferes with clarity, it can become dangerous. And the next principle reveals something even more unsettling. Emotional people are the easiest people to control. Rule 3. Strategic detachment creates power. Most people believe that caring deeply about everything makes them better people. But caring deeply about everything often makes you weak, because the more emotionally invested you are in every situation, the easier it becomes for others to influence you. Think about how often people are controlled through emotion. Guilt, sympathy, obligation. Someone tells you their tragic story. Someone reminds you of what you owe them. Someone frames their problem in a way that makes you feel responsible, and before you realize it, you are making decisions that do not actually serve your own life. You are reacting to emotional pressure, not to reality. This is why strategic detachment is such a powerful skill, the ability to step back emotionally and observe a situation without being pulled into it. The heartless man does something most people struggle to do. He listens without absorbing. He observes without reacting. He evaluates the situation based on facts, not feelings. If someone is trying to guilt him, he sees it. If someone is manipulating sympathy, he notices it. If someone is creating emotional drama to influence his decisions, he recognizes the pattern. And because he is not emotionally entangled, he remains free. Free to say no. Free to walk away. Free to make the decision that actually serves his future. This is why strategic detachment often looks like coldness to people who rely on emotional influence. They are used to controlling situations through feelings, but when they encounter someone who does not immediately respond emotionally, their tactics lose their power, because manipulation requires emotional participation, and the moment you stop participating emotionally, the entire dynamic changes. Suddenly you are no longer reacting, you are deciding, and the person who decides rather than reacts always holds the real power, which leads us directly to the next principle. Rule 4. Selective apathy. One of the most difficult lessons in life is learning that not everyone deserves access to your empathy. Society often repeats the phrase, "Blood is thicker than water." This phrase is frequently used by toxic family members as a weapon. A brother who refuses to work expects financial support. A relative who constantly creates chaos demands emotional loyalty. A manipulative parent insists that family obligations override personal boundaries. And because of guilt, many people comply. They answer every call. They listen to every complaint. They give one more chance, then another, and another. but eventually they find themselves emotionally exhausted because they are trying to rescue someone who does not want to be saved. The Stoic achiever understands something painful but necessary. A drowning person will often pull their rescuer under just to take one more breath. If you jump into the water without preparation, both of you disappear. This is where selective apathy becomes essential. Selective apathy means refusing to engage with emotional manipulation. It means recognizing when someone's suffering has become a strategy. It means understanding that compassion without boundaries is not kindness. It is self-destruction. The heartless move in situations like this often appears cruel to outside observers. You stop answering the late-night calls. You stop sending money. You stop reacting to guilt-driven messages. You allow silence to replace constant emotional involvement. From the outside, this behavior may appear cold, but in reality, it is the only way to protect your own stability, because you cannot repair someone who uses their brokenness as leverage. And sometimes the most compassionate act is refusing to participate in a destructive pattern. But selective apathy does not only apply to family relationships, it also appears in professional environments. And this leads directly to the fifth principle. Rule 5. The betrayal of the diligent. Imagine you start a business or a creative project. You are excited, motivated, focused on building something meaningful. And because loyalty feels important to you, you hire a close friend to help. At first, the arrangement feels natural. You trust them. You want to help them succeed. But slowly the problems begin. They arrive late. They miss deadlines. They treat the opportunity casually. Meanwhile, the rest of the team is working hard. They are sacrificing time, energy, and effort to move the project forward. And now you face a decision. Do you keep your friend because you care about the relationship? Or do you remove them because the project requires discipline? Many people choose the first option. They keep the friend. They tolerate the behavior. They convince themselves that loyalty is more important than performance. But what they rarely realize is that this decision creates a silent injustice. Because by protecting the incompetent person, they are betraying the diligent ones. They are punishing the people who are actually doing the work. And this is why leadership sometimes requires emotional detachment. The heartless move in this situation is simple. You remove the friend. Not because you hate them, not because you lack empathy, but because responsibility demands it. The moment you allow personal emotion to override objective standards, the entire system begins to deteriorate. Standards weaken. Motivation declines. Resentment grows. And eventually the project collapses. Steve Jobs faced a similar dilemma when he returned to Apple in 1997. At the time, Apple was weeks away from bankruptcy. The company had dozens of products in development, multiple overlapping teams, confusing priorities. Jobs walked into a meeting with the executive team and did something brutally simple. He drew a 4-square grid: desktop, portable, consumer, professional. Then he said something that shocked everyone in the room. Every other product was being cancelled. Projects that people had worked on for years were eliminated overnight. Entire teams were dismissed. Employees were furious. Developers felt betrayed. Many described the decision as heartless. But Jobs understood something the others could not see. If Apple continued trying to do everything, it would accomplish nothing. By stripping away the noise, he saved the company. And in doing so, he ultimately preserved thousands of jobs that would have disappeared if Apple had collapsed. His decision hurt individuals in the short term, but it saved the entire organization in the long term. And that is the brutal paradox of leadership. Sometimes you must choose between being liked and being effective. The Stoic achiever understands that effectiveness often requires emotional discipline, but emotional discipline requires something even more difficult: the courage to say no. And that brings us to the next principle: the cold no. Rule 6: the power of the cold. One of the most powerful words in the English language is a word most people are afraid to use. No. Not a long explanation. Not an apology. Not a carefully negotiated compromise. Just one word. No. Most people struggle with this because they have been conditioned to believe that saying no is rude, selfish, disrespectful. So instead they say things like, "I wish I could, but maybe another time. I'll see what I can do." But every time you soften your refusal, you give the other person something extremely valuable: room to negotiate, room to push, room to persuade. And suddenly, what should have been a boundary becomes a debate. Manipulators understand this perfectly. They know that if they keep talking long enough, your discomfort will eventually make you surrender. You will give in simply to make the conversation stop. But the Stoic achiever behaves differently. He understands that boundaries do not require justification. When you explain your decision, you invite the other person to challenge it. They can question your reasons. They can argue against your logic. They can pressure you emotionally. But when the answer is simply, "No, that doesn't work for me," the conversation ends. There is nothing left to negotiate. This is what psychologists sometimes call the cold no. It is not aggressive. It is not angry. It is simply final. And while this may appear harsh to people who are used to emotional negotiation, it is one of the clearest expressions of self-respect. Because every time you say yes to something you do not actually want, you are sacrificing a portion of your life, your time, your energy, your attention, and those resources are limited. Carl Jung once made an observation that reveals something fascinating about human behavior. He said that if you are a nice person all the time, you are usually a shadowless person, and a man without a shadow is not a whole man. In other words, people who try to appear endlessly agreeable often suppress an entire part of their personality, the part capable of firmness, the part capable of saying no, the part capable of protecting boundaries. True psychological maturity does not come from pretending to be harmless. It comes from integrating both sides of your nature, the compassionate side and the ruthless side. You possess both. Every human being does. But discipline means learning when each side should be used, which leads us to one of the most difficult situations where emotional detachment becomes necessary. Rule 7: the decisive exit. One of the most painful forms of dishonesty in modern life hides behind a mask of kindness, staying in a relationship that has already ended. You know the situation. The spark has disappeared. The connection feels forced. The conversations are routine. Your values are drifting in different directions. But you remain. Why? Because leaving would hurt the other person. You do not want to be the villain in the story. You do not want to see tears. You do not want to deal with the guilt. So instead, you continue pretending. Pretending that things might improve. Pretending that patience will fix what is fundamentally broken. Pretending that time will somehow reverse emotional reality. But what most people do not realize is that this behavior is not kindness. It is delay. And delay can be cruel, because every day you stay in a relationship that has already died, you are stealing time, your time, and the other person's time. time that could be used to find someone genuinely compatible, time that could be used to grow, time that could be used to heal. Instead, both people remain trapped in a slow emotional decline. The Stoic achiever approaches this situation with surgical clarity. The moment he recognizes that the relationship is truly over, he acts. Not out of anger, not out of cold indifference, but out of respect for reality. He ends it. Cleanly, directly, without creating false hope. Yes, the conversation will be painful. Yes, emotions will surface. Yes, he may appear heartless in the eyes of others. But the decisive exit is far more humane than the slow erosion of honesty. It is a surgical cut, a painful moment that allows healing to begin. Compare this to what often happens when people avoid the decision. Months of passive aggression, silent resentment, arguments that solve nothing, emotional exhaustion. Infections spread when wounds are ignored, and relationships are no different. Sometimes the most compassionate act is the one that feels the coldest, ending something honestly. But this principle reveals something even deeper. Most people believe that kindness means avoiding difficult actions. The Stoic perspective is very different. Kindness without courage is weakness. Because if you cannot perform the difficult action when it becomes necessary, you are not choosing kindness. You are simply avoiding discomfort. And this leads us to one of the most powerful psychological ideas ever expressed. Jordan Peterson once made an observation that startled many listeners. He said that a man who is not capable of being a monster is not virtuous. He is merely harmless. Think about that. A harmless person cannot truly choose kindness. Because kindness is only meaningful when cruelty is possible. If you do not possess the capacity for ruthlessness, restraint is not virtue. It is limitation. True virtue requires strength, the strength to be capable of ruthless action, and the wisdom to keep that sword in its sheath until the moment demands it. Being heartless means possessing the sword. Being disciplined means knowing when to draw it and when to leave it untouched. This brings us to the final and most important realization. Strategic detachment is not about becoming colder as a person. It is about becoming more deliberate, more controlled, more conscious of when emotion should guide your actions and when emotion must step aside. Because a life governed entirely by emotion is not a life of freedom. It is a life of constant reaction. And the man who reacts constantly is never truly in control. Rule 8. The leader's burden. Decisions without comfort. There is a moment in every position of leadership where emotion must step aside. It is the moment where the comfortable choice and the correct choice are no longer the same. This is the moment where the leader discovers whether he is guided by feelings or by responsibility. History gives us many examples of this brutal test, but few are as striking as the decisions made by Napoleon Bonaparte during his campaigns. In 1799, during the siege of Jaffa, Napoleon's army was struck by a devastating outbreak of plague. Thousands of soldiers were infected. Medicine was scarce, transportation was limited, and an enemy army was approaching quickly. Napoleon faced a nightmare calculation. If he remained behind to care for the infected soldiers, his entire army could be trapped and annihilated. Tens of thousands of men could die. But abandoning the sick soldiers would mean leaving them to the mercy of an enemy known for brutality and torture. There was no compassionate solution, only a strategic one. Napoleon allegedly ordered that the most terminally ill soldiers be given lethal doses of opium so they would not fall into enemy hands. Then he moved the rest of the army forward. To the sentimental observer, this decision appears monstrous, but the strategist sees the calculation. Sacrifice the pawn to save the king. The alternative was not mercy. The alternative was catastrophe. Leadership often lives inside these impossible dilemmas, and the uncomfortable truth is that the people responsible for large outcomes must sometimes make decisions that feel cold on a personal level. Because the scale of responsibility changes the nature of morality. When the fate of thousands depends on your judgment, emotional hesitation can become deadly. This is the burden of command, and most people never experience it. But the lesson still applies in everyday life. Every person becomes the leader of something. Their business, their family, their time, their future. And eventually, everyone faces decisions where protecting the greater good requires disappointing someone in the moment. This is where strategic detachment becomes necessary, because emotion often focuses on the immediate discomfort, but strategy focuses on the long-term outcome. And that brings us to one of the most misunderstood ideas about heartlessness. Heartlessness is not cruelty. It is clarity. Rule 9. The heartless decision that saved Apple. In 1997, Apple Computer was collapsing. The company had lost billions. Its product line was chaotic. Dozens of overlapping devices were being produced. Executives disagreed on strategy, and analysts predicted the company would disappear within months. Then Steve Jobs returned. Many people expected him to be inspiring, motivational, supportive. Instead, he was brutally focused. Jobs gathered Apple's leadership team and asked a simple question: what products should we build? The room filled with suggestions, ideas, defenses of projects that teams had worked on for years. Jobs listened quietly. Then he walked to a whiteboard and drew a simple grid. 2 rows, 2 columns. Desktop, portable, consumer, professional. Then he delivered a sentence that stunned everyone. We are going to make 4 products. Everything else was cancelled. Entire departments were eliminated. Projects that engineers had invested years of their lives into were terminated. Hundreds of employees lost their jobs. Inside Apple, many people described the move as ruthless, heartless, insensitive. But Jobs was not thinking about individual projects. He was thinking about survival. Apple had become unfocused, overcomplicated, emotionally attached to ideas that no longer served the company's future. By cutting everything that did not fit the new strategy, Jobs forced Apple to concentrate its resources, and the results changed history. From those 4 product categories, eventually emerged the iMac, the iPod, the iPhone, the iPad. Devices that transformed Apple into the most valuable company on Earth. Jobs' decision hurt individuals in the short term, but it saved the entire organization in the long term. This is the brutal paradox of effective leadership. Sometimes compassion toward individuals creates disaster for the larger system, and sometimes a decision that appears cold protects thousands of futures. This is why strategic detachment is not cruelty. It is discipline. The ability to separate emotion from analysis when the stakes demand it. But this idea leads to a deeper question. If being heartless can sometimes produce good outcomes, what prevents it from becoming dangerous? What prevents someone from sliding into pure selfishness? The answer lies in the final principle. Rule 10. The discipline of the sword. Jordan Peterson once expressed a psychological idea that startled many people when they first heard it. He said that a man who is incapable of being a monster is not virtuous. He is simply harmless. At first glance, this statement feels disturbing. Why would anyone want to be capable of monstrosity? But Peterson was pointing toward a deeper truth about human nature. True virtue does not come from weakness. It comes from strength under control. Imagine a person who is physically incapable of violence, who lacks the courage to confront anyone, who avoids conflict at all costs. Is that person peaceful, or are they simply powerless? Peace is meaningful only when aggression is possible. Kindness is meaningful only when cruelty is available. If you are incapable of doing harm, then your restraint is not a moral achievement. It is merely a limitation. The Stoics understood this clearly. They did not seek to remove emotion from their lives. They sought to master it. They did not try to eliminate anger, fear, or ambition. They trained themselves not to be controlled by those forces. Strategic detachment follows the same philosophy. The Stoic achiever does not destroy his empathy. He governs it. He keeps it available, but he decides when it will influence his actions. Sometimes, empathy is the correct response. When someone needs support, when a friend suffers, when compassion creates healing. But other moments demand something different. A calm refusal, a difficult boundary, a strategic decision that may look cold to the outside world. This is where discipline becomes essential, because the purpose of learning to be heartless is not to live without feeling. It is to ensure that feeling does not dominate reason. The sword exists, but it remains in the sheath until the moment requires it. What then is the difference between kindness and effectiveness? The world constantly encourages you to be agreeable, to avoid conflict, to prioritize other people's feelings above your own goals. And while kindness is valuable, there is a danger hidden inside this message. Because when kindness becomes your only strategy, you become predictable, and predictable people are easy to control. Strategic detachment changes this dynamic. It teaches you to observe emotion without obeying it, to listen without reacting, to make decisions based on clarity rather than pressure. And once you develop this ability, something remarkable happens. The chaos around you loses its power. Manipulators lose their leverage. Emotional storms lose their intensity, because the person who cannot be provoked cannot be controlled. This is the real meaning of becoming heartless. Not cruelty, not indifference, but control. The control to pause before reacting. The control to separate emotion from strategy. The control to choose the correct action rather than the comfortable one. And once you develop that discipline, you discover something that many people spend their entire lives searching for. Freedom. Freedom from manipulation. Freedom from emotional exhaustion. Freedom from the constant pressure to please everyone around you. The Stoic achiever understands that empathy is a powerful tool, but like every powerful tool, it must be used carefully. Too much of it at the wrong moment can destroy the very thing you are trying to protect. So the real question is not whether you should be compassionate. The real question is whether you have the strength to be strategic when compassion becomes dangerous. Because the men who shape history, the men who build companies, the men who lead families, the men who change the direction of their own lives, all understand one uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the kindest decision feels heartless, and sometimes the heartless decision saves everything.